Good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar, a look at H-2B for labor solutions at your golf course with Carrie Koski and Dave Wagner, brought to you by GCSAA and GCSAA. I'm Lisa Wick, the Senior Manager of E-Learning Programs, and will serve as today's moderator. An available workforce has been and continues to be a critical issue for golf course operators and owners. We bring forward this webinar today because there's been an increase in the level of interest in the use of the H-2B visa program, and we wanted to provide some basic information on how the program actually works.
Thank you very much, Lisa, and thank you everybody for joining today. Dave and I assist with the H-2B visa program pretty routinely, and we're deep in it now for the winter season starting October 1st. I've been handling H-2Bs since I joined Ogletree in 2013, and I think it's important to just outline the lens from which we are approaching the H-2B program today as attorneys. As attorneys, we not only prepare and file H-2B visa applications, but we also provide advice and counsel to organizations that use agents or recruiting agencies or staffing firms to secure their H-2B workers. And sometimes that includes counseling companies through audits or wage and hour investigations. So we pay special attention to the appropriate use and sometimes misuse of the H-2B program. Today we'll talk about the mechanics of the process, which can be very cumbersome if any of you have ever been involved with the labor market test and recruitment and analyzing U.S. workers. And then we'll talk a little bit about red flags and pitfalls. If there's anything that you take away today, it's probably red flags and pitfalls, so that you understand the risks and whether you want to make the business decision to carry those risks or walk away from it. And we'll also share the latest news. Since 2015, there's been a lot of changes regulatorily, and the rules just keep on changing because, as you know, the demand for H-2Bs continues to grow with the limited number available due to the cap.
Yes, no, kind of. Okay. Well, that's good for the no's. That's helpful. 68%. That's a lot higher than I expected. Yeah. So my name's Dave Wagner again, and I just wanted to let you know I've learned everything I know from Carrie Koski. I came into with Ogletree in 2019, right when a lot of these changes went into effect with the H-2B program. So we've worked together, Carrie and I, to get through these changes. The big change is the April 1st start date, and they actually have done this for the October 1st start date. It's just not as large of an issue because they don't reach that cap so quickly, or they don't have as many positions being requested. But around 2019, there was a new group selection process with the Department of Labor, where previously it was at midnight. Previously it was, midnight, the New Year's Eve, that you would be filing your temporary labor certifications. Now they give us a window, usually about 3 days, to file. And last year was January 1st through January 3rd, but they give us a 3-day window to file these temporary labor certifications, ETA 9142Bs, with the Department of Labor. And then they do a random selection process, putting everyone in, as many groups as they need. But, I think there was about 66 pages of groups this last April 1st start date, and there was about 100 petitions or applications on each page. So there was a large amount, and it went group A through F this last season. So that's a big change. It makes it a little bit easier, but it's kind of a fight to, at least there's not that time stamping at midnight on New Year's Eve anymore. So that's a big change that happened a couple of years ago. And the other big change is the change with advertising requirements. We don't have the same local newspaper advertising that we used to have. And now what the Department of Labor does is they actually take the information we provide to them and they post that on seasonaljobs.dol.gov. And you can actually go and look at, your postings or, any other companies out there. And I think the idea behind this, at least the theory, is that these jobs will be pulled, outside of that local newspaper and advertised more widely across the nation. It's supposed to be scraped and pulled into other types of advertising as well, so LinkedIn or other things like that. Generally, I haven't seen too much of that, but that is the idea, I believe. So that's kind of the main updates since 2019. Sorry, there we go. And then to kind of get into the basics of when is hiring H-2B workers appropriate, the idea behind H-2Bs is that this is going to be a temporary need for unskilled or skilled workers. Unskilled, a lot of times we have groundskeepers, food and beverage assistants, housekeepers, landscapers, and then we've also done skilled workers before, where veterinarians and a couple other types of professions, but generally it's more the unskilled side of things. It's going to be for a specific position. We do the specific position and specific worksite locations, sometimes being around that worksite location or that office, within that a radius of 60 miles or something along those lines. But then we do have to do it for a specific time period, and that's based on the temporary need information that we can provide and gather, about the business and when there is a potential influx of work. The employer is unable to fulfill hiring need. This is one of the requirements. You have to show that you're going through the recruitment measures and making sure that there's no qualified U.S. workers out there that could fill these positions, and then also that the foreign workers are not going to negatively affect U.S. workers, either for the company currently working or that could be qualified for the position. So the main general idea behind all of this is that the H-2B program has become so strict and it's very rigid. So ensuring that we all understand the requirements and that you do have that temporary need is quite important. And so for golf courses, I think that's a lot more clear probably than other types of industries.
So as Dave mentioned, temporary need is really the foundation of the H-2B program. And a little factoid I think that is really interesting is that the H-2B program is a guest worker program, and it's based on the Bracero program, which was a Mexican guest worker program started in the 1940s during wartime to supplement labor needs in the United States. That program ended several decades ago, but the replacement has been the H-2B program. And the H-2B program and the temporary guest worker program is really the foundation of every employment-based visa or work authorization opportunity. Because I don't know if you knew this, but every work authorized visa is temporary. It's just that the H-2B visa is the most temporary. And here's why. So we're really focused on temporary jobs, not year-round positions. So employers are required to state the actual date of the month that the temporary need begins and the date and the month that it ends. It's precise. And then to evidence that period, let's say it's October 1st through March 31st, to provide evidence in the form of business documentation to demonstrate that there's a bump in business, that there's a business bump, that there's a demand for extra labor during that time. We have seasonal need, which typically ends when the season ends. Peak load is supplemental, and this is where we do most of our work. Supplemental workers are added to year-round permanent workforces. And then a one-time occurrence. Recently, we've seen this most often in response to natural disasters, to rebuild in construction. It also occurs in development projects. Temporary construction is heavily used with the H-2B program, or intermittent or other temporary need, but it's extremely difficult to demonstrate a temporary need unless substantial business documentation is supplied. So for example, let's say there's an H-2B employer that's a golf course in Wisconsin. The peak load would likely be simple because the golf course would likely not need as many workers during the winter months. You know, and you would supply documentation for tea times, revenue documents, and other type of business documentation to demonstrate that temporary uptick in the need for labor. So because the primary requirement for the H-2B program is temporary need, the Department of Labor is always looking for red flags or indicators that an employer is attempting to misuse the program. And, you know, in other words, that there's actually a permanent need. For example, you know, we get a lot of inquiries from manufacturers or production companies that are just generating products and goods. But it's almost impossible to show that there's a busier time of year in manufacturing or production than any other time of year. So we have difficulty, and we typically don't recommend securing H-2B visas in manufacturing or production. If an employer files, for example, 2 different applications for 2 different times of the year, let's say you have a resort in Montana that needs landscapers in the summer and then snow removers in the winter, the Department of Labor is going to look at that and say, no, that's just one position that does 2 minorly different things at different times of year. That's not to say that some organizations have 2 distinct seasons. There are resorts that will have, you know, a winter ski season and then a summer tourist season. It's just that the Department of Labor looks at those types of situations more closely and will likely issue notices of deficiencies to scrutinize those types of situations. Another red flag for temporary need would be a lull in the peak load. Let's say you have an October through March peak load, but in January you have a dip in business. Sometimes Department of Labor will come back and claim that, you know, your H-2B workers are just filling in for permanent workers that go on vacation or take leave. So these are all red flags. And then the other kind of obvious red flag is an unpredictable or subject to change season. Department of Labor looks at historical data. So if you're not able to demonstrate, let's say, 3 years of a particular season, again, it's a date and a month. If you're not able to show an uptick in the need for demand during a specific time, then the H-2 likely will not be successful. The other factor, which Department of Labor looks at very closely, is that H-2B positions are for a specific occupation and for a specific period of time. So we talked a little bit about the temporary need, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute again. But one thing that we run into a lot is when we deal with audits and investigations, is that the Department of Labor sees that an H-2B employer is using those H-2B workers in an occupation that isn't certified. In other words, the H-2B employer will request certification for like a banquet staff position, but when the worker is hired, they'll be asked to do landscaping. That's non-compliant, and if there's an investigation, there will certainly be penalties for that violation. Just to reiterate, the temporary period has to be precise. I've said this a couple times, but we're talking about a date and a month. And if it changes year over year, the business has to be very specific as to why it's changed. We've had some clients try to bring workers a week earlier than their date of need, as they indicated in prior years. But to justify that week earlier, because those H-2B workers need to come and prepare to help prepare the property or for the event, to be there a little bit early. So changes in the specific date and time year over year is okay, but it needs to be justified and warranted. Again, business documents will help you show your date of need, tea time records, occupancy reports, revenue, payroll records, full-time versus part-time work. In an audit investigation, the Department of Labor loves to pull payroll records and do a forensic level analysis on the need. Also, publicly available information that shows there is an uptick in tourism or other type of business. We often use Chamber of Commerce records or news articles featuring an uptick in tourism in a particular time of year. I think we're going to talk a little bit about the period of need a little bit more, and Dave is going to take that away.
Yeah, and just to jump off of what you said, Carrie, about, if we change the start date a week, or 5 to 10 days is usually our maximum, and that's still concerning when we do change a date from a prior year. The first thing I think the Department of Labor does is they go and they look and they see, what did we do last year? What, if we had a certification from the prior year, what was the start date? What were the positions being requested? And they literally go right back to the year before, it seems. We've got notice of deficiencies where we've changed it a little, the start date or something, and that's the first thing they say is, this was in the file before, why is it different this year? Or if you're changing the number of the amount of employees or H-2B workers you're requesting, we also have to be prepared to, provide evidence of, this is going to be an uptick this year in this part of the business, and so we do expect, we do require more workers this year. So that's also something to keep in mind when you're doing that start date. But yeah, so the specific time frame for a single H-2B application, generally it's no more than 9 months. The one big reason behind this is because the further you go out, the further the amount of time you ask for, that's going to hurt your temporary need argument. For peak load or seasonal, that's a pretty clear indication that it's starting to get outside of this temporary need. And so we don't, it kind of hurts the argument when you go beyond that. There is a 3-year total stay exception for the individual H-2B worker. They are able to go from one temporary labor certification, let's say April 1st to November or something along those lines, and then go to a winter potentially temporary labor certification with another petitioner, another employer, and then kind of do that switch back and forth up to a 3-year period of stay. And that's kind of a tactic some employers do, and that's our strategy we mentioned below. If that individual remains in the United States, let's say they just came in for October 1st start date, or they're coming in the October 1st start date, they would be able to potentially switch over, and they've already been counted under the cap. So that's a big benefit. You're able to use those workers on potentially a temporary labor certification for your company if they've already been counted under another company or petitioner's H-2B application. And that's basically, and once we get to that 3-year total, they do have to reset the clock, is what we say. They have to just travel, and then they can still come back on an H-2B visa, but they would have to reset the clock. So what we have to do when we get into the recruitment phase of the ETA 9142B, we would have to place a job order with the state workforce agency. The government, just on their own accord, takes the job information and posts that on seasonaldjobs.dol.gov. And then there has to be the internal posting. The job opportunity has to be placed at the place of employment. And then we do have to contact any former U.S. workers or U.S. employees that held the same position or similar position. Sometimes we have to assess how closely related it is, but within the last year. At the end of this process, we do have to file a recruitment summary with the Department of Labor explaining what steps we've taken, and it's an initial step in the recruitment process, but it's not the full recruitment phase. You have to continue to accept U.S. workers applying for the position up to 21 days prior to the start date. And that is the big change, again, is the seasonaldjobs.dol.gov. Previously, we had to go through newspaper advertising, like a local newspaper, and that added time to this process. And so for the April 1st start date, we've been seeing, and that starts the filing in January 1st. This last year, the cap was hit for April 1st start date on February 12th, 2021, and that's the fastest it's ever been hit, it's ever been met. And that's likely due to this new change in recruiting. The individuals who are open for 15 business days, they generally have the best chances of success in getting into the CAP because if they're open 7 days a week, that is considered a business day, and that the recruiting and advertising counts towards the 15 business days. So that's probably why these have been moving faster than they have in the past, and just generally there's a higher need, it seems, right now for H-2B workers. There are some compliance measures that have to be taken into account for the H-2B program. Like we were talking about, all the U.S. workers would have to be notified if there's prior layoffs or anything like that. But then outside of that, the benefits that the position offers to a U.S. worker has to be the same that it's offering to an H-2B worker. I talked about the no layoffs in the last year. They would have to be notified during recruitment. No preferential treatment to foreign workers, and then no discrimination against U.S. workers. So basically, we're just trying to explain that any of the benefits offered would need to be offered to both U.S. workers or H-2B workers. So that's basically, if there's no costs for uniforms and somebody, for the U.S. workers, but they're charging the H-2B workers for the uniform costs, cleaning, things like that, that would be a kind of a big red flag. So that's what we've ran into before with uniforms, and making sure any deductions from pay or anything like that is included in the advertising, in the job information that we use with the Department of Labor. The other things that have to be covered by the employer is the transportation costs from the home country and back. This is dependent on completing a certain percentage, over 50% of the H-2B contract, or the period that's requested for the H-2B workers. And then that cost is the most, the reasonable cost of a common carrier charge. So not first class or something along those lines. But then the other guarantee that we have to provide is that 3/4 of the work days in each 12-week period would be completed. So that's, if you put 40-hour full-time schedule in the job information, it would have to be at least the 35 hours per week or more is fine, but you have to guarantee 3/4 of those hours essentially, or that work is guaranteed. The H-2B workers cannot pay for legal fees, visa fees, recruitment. That can't be passed on to the H-2B workers. And then there is a very big regulation of H-2B foreign labor recruiters. That's because they technically can have joint and several liability for the petitioner, the employer, and what is performed by this foreign labor recruiter. So it's really important to know what they're doing and that they're not violating any technical rules or anything like that. So it is important to know who is doing your recruiting in the other country. Dissimilar from the H-2A program, room and board and other fringe benefits is not required. For the H-2A agricultural program, they do have to provide housing, but that's different with the H-2Bs. That's not required. All right, and Carrie, I think this one's back to you.
So impacts of U.S. worker protections. Dave mentioned a little bit about corresponding employment, and this is really a hot button issue for DOL in the context of audits, and especially wage and hour audits, and then also with the Department of State. In recent years, we've seen the Department of State and the Department of Labor investigate J-1 programs where those J-1 workers were placed in corresponding occupations to H-2B workers, and this also applies to U.S. workers who are in those corresponding positions. So essentially, if you have a lift attendant at a ski resort and you sponsor H-2B workers in that occupation, and you also sponsor J-1 employees in that occupation, and you also have temporary U.S. Citizen workers in that occupation, you would have to pay for the transportation for each of those temporary workers. So, maybe in the United States, that's domestic transportation from their state to your location. For those H-2B workers, it would be, maybe quite a number of individuals from their location to their country of origin to your location. And then for those J-1 employees, they may be from the Southern Hemisphere, from New Zealand or Argentina. You would also have to pay for their airfare or their travel to your location. So this can get quite expensive. And, the point is, it's important to distinguish your H-2B occupations from different temporary worker occupations and to sort of single out the need so that you're not sort of muddying the waters with U.S. workers and other visa-sponsored employees in the same H-2B occupations just to avoid the compliance issue because it is a target. This does not apply, however, to incumbent workers. So if you have permanent workers in those occupations and you're supplementing that permanent workforce with H-2B workers, you don't necessarily have to provide all of the benefits to the permanent incumbent workers that you would provide to the H-2B workers if those permanent workers have been there for, a certain number of years. So if you have year-round landscapers that have been with you for years and years and years, you don't really have to worry about how you're treating them. Well, you do for other reasons, for other discrimination reasons, but at least not in connection with the H-2B program. They won't look at those incumbent workers compared to the benefits that the H-2B workers are receiving. I do need to caveat again that there are other discrimination issues that might come into play, but at least not with H-2B workers if the similar or same occupation workers are permanent workers in that occupation. Now, DOL has penalized employers in the past who try to disguise corresponding employment, maybe different job titles, or adding a job duty or removing a job duty. DOL is pretty suspicious of these situations, and if there is a wage and hour audit, I think I mentioned that they really take a forensic approach and will pull payroll records, time cards, job duties, job descriptions to ascertain whether corresponding workers are receiving the same benefits as the H-2B workers. Another thing I want to point out, and Dave mentioned this a little bit in terms of obligations to H-2B workers, is that you can't discriminate. You can't discriminate against your U.S. workers. You can't discriminate against your H-2B workers or any other visa employment authorized workers. But if you are offering, for example, housing or other sort of fringe benefits or opportunities to your workers, it needs to be fair and market value. We've seen instances where H-2B workers have brought claims against employers because their working conditions aren't fair, they're not receiving the number of hours that were promised to them. And this actually comes up quite a bit when employers are using H-2B agents or staffing companies or recruiting companies in order to secure that workforce, and that subcontractor is doing wrong or misusing the H-2B program. But as Dave said, there can be joint and several liability. So the ultimate employer can be brought in as a joint party and liable. So just things to keep in mind if you're using the H-2B program, that you really want to be aware of your obligations to all workers and to make sure that you're meeting those obligations. I think we can go to the poll now. Let's see here. 13% have had people depart. The lucky 17% haven't had anybody depart. Congratulations. And then many folks don't use H-2B workers. So the next question, there's another poll question right after this question, is related. And again, this is it's not a trick question, but we're going to talk about the compliance issue. So the next question is, it's a follow-up question. Did you provide the government for the 13% that have folks leave, did you provide the government with the appropriate notification if a worker departed from your company prior to the end of the contract period?
And you don't have to answer this if you
Yeah,
don't
and
want.
we're not going to share it with the Department of Labor.
It's just to gain kind
or
of
just to ponder, really.
Right.
But we'll give you some time to think about that. And vote if you want to. Again, we're not going to share this.
And we can close this one probably shorter. It's just a flow into the next kind of things we're talking about.
So, all right, great. I mean, there's a lot of compliance out there. So upon termination, whether it be voluntary or involuntary, employers are required to notify the U.S. Department of Labor and the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. So there are 2 compliance steps in connection with any termination of an H-2B worker prior to the end of the contract. And really, this is meant to allow the Department of Homeland Security and Department of Labor to monitor the program and to potentially monitor those folks that left, because then they would be considered to potentially be violating status. So it's just very important to notify the authorities if anybody leaves. Now, if somebody's a no-show, if you bring folks in the United States in an H-2B program and they start working, but then they're a no-show, you should monitor that situation for 5 days. And if they don't show up on the 5th day, then that's effectively a termination. And then you have 2 days after that 5-day period to notify USCIS or DOL. So it's 7 days from the start of that no-show. It also applies if you have people that don't show up or don't show up at all. So they get their visas, their H-2Bs, but never come to your location. Just something to remember from a compliance point of view, it does come up, wage and hour audits. Again, forensic level deep dive into your H-2B program if you're ever audited by the Wage and Hour Division. Dave is going to talk about the mechanics of the H-2B program now.
Thanks, Carrie. Yeah, and it's just important to note that when we're notifying Department of Labor, Department of Homeland Security, that it is pretty quick turnaround. Usually, we'd want to notify them within the next 2 to 3 days, if possible. And sorry, oh, here we go. There we go. All right. And so we usually break this process down into 2 parts. There's the process with Department of Labor, getting through a temporary labor certification, actually being certified by the Department of Labor, and then there is the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services side of things with Department of Homeland Security. That's another agency, but we have 2 steps to the process, more or less. The first step with the Department of Labor is, even before that, we have to gather all the job descriptions and all the information about the job, and then we file prevailing wage determination to the Department of Labor. And on average, those are taking about, I would say, 3 to 4 weeks. Mostly we've been seeing about 4 weeks to get those returned, that wage determined, and that's based on the worksite location and the job description and the other information about the job position. Then once we get the prevailing wage determination, we can prepare the ETA 9142B, the job order. We generally prepare that even before filing the ETA 9142B, and then when appropriate, which is 90 to 75 days prior to the start date, you're able to file the ETA 9142B with the Department of Labor. Generally, they will review the case, and if it all looks fine to them, they'll issue a notice of acceptance, meaning we can start recruitment, and that's when you want to be prepared to file everything with having the job order ready and everything ready to go for recruitment, posting that internal posting, and having that process started immediately, especially with that April 1st start date, because as soon as you get through the 15 business days, you are able to file your initial recruitment summary with the Department of Labor, and then that's when they'll review that, and if everything looks good to them, they will either issue a full certification for the specific amount of jobs you've requested for the specific validity period, or if you have found U.S. workers or individuals to fill those positions that have been requested, they will generally, deduct from the total that was requested, and then issue a partial certification, or they can also do that if they shorten your validity period. But then once you have that certification from the Department of Labor, you move over to Department of Homeland Security, and that's where we file a form I-129, and that's, sometimes you can do unnamed workers if you don't have all that information. Other times you can actually include each specific person's information, each H-2B worker that you're applying for, essentially. And then the premium processing fee is still $1,500 for H-2Bs. It's been moved up for a lot of other non-immigrant visa categories, but H-2B, it still remains $1,500. And the premium processing is a 15 calendar day period of time where the government has time to review the case and issue either an approval most often or a request for evidence, and they would ask for more information that they need in order to adjudicate the case. Once that's approved, then we actually move to another federal agency, the Department of State, and that's through the U.S. Embassy or Consulate, and that's where the individual H-2B worker would actually have to obtain an H-2B visa to then enter to the United States. This was likely for individuals or companies who had H-2B workers last year. This is generally where we had issues having those visas actually issued to individuals. That was a holdup. So timelines for filing. Usually it's 90 to 75 days prior that we can file the ETA 9142B. But prior to that, we like to get these started at least a month to 2 months prior to even that 90-day window. That way, everything can be finalized, and then the prevailing wage can be filed with the Department of Labor, months before you're actually in that 90-day window, and even a month before that 90-day window. So generally, it's at least 120 days before we like to have the whole prevailing wage prepared and filed, and that way it gives us time to have the next step, the ETA 9142B, prepared and filed. The latest you can file without an emergency situation is 75 days before the date of need. And with recruitment, like I was saying, it's been kind of expedited, and so having the job order prepared for the state workforce agency upon filing the ETA 9142B is the best course of action, so you have that ready to go and actually provide it to Department of Labor, the full notice text sometimes. But once you get through the recruitment again, for that April 1st start date, that's the most critical aspect, I would say. Getting that recruitment done expeditiously and having your I-129 ready to file, because the cap is actually counted by Department of Homeland Security. And so having your position submitted to them and having the case accepted, and that's another reason I normally recommend premium processing, just so you get that e-notice, the electronic notice to your email that your case was accepted for processing and you've made it into the cap, essentially. So it's become much, much faster, and that's as much as I can emphasize it. It has become a race to get your I-129 filed to USCIS. And that's, again, I mentioned premium processing is still a $1,500 filing fee, and there's a government filing fee of $460. So my strategy to all of you out there, if you're moving through the April 1st start date, obviously having everything filed January 1st through the window they give us with the Department of Labor for this next year, and then once you've made it through recruitment, even beforehand, potentially having your form I-129 drafted and ready to be filed once you receive the certification from the Department of Labor. Yeah, so general pitfalls or issues that we run into and we try to avoid as much as possible. Cap-related issues, the April 1st start date time period, that's not really something that we can control. Even filing as soon as you can on January 1st, there's a window now that generally of these 3 days. So the cap-related issues are kind of outside the control of any attorney or anyone else who's preparing these. It's just up to the Department of Labor, and they put you in those groups A through F, or more potentially, and then that's how they go through adjudicating those ETA 9142Bs. And so that's that's kind of something that's out of the control. The October 1st start date is a little easier to control, and last year that was in mid-November that the cap was met for the October 1st start date season. Enforcement mechanisms, that's, we try to, from our side of things, the attorneys are involved in making sure we stay compliant with all of the requirements of the H-2B program. And then if there is non-compliance or there's an audit or, there's an issue down the road, there are potential penalties for, violations of the H-2B program. So as I mentioned, I don't want to keep harping on the, how fast it's moving now, but the fiscal year 2021, that April 1st start date, it was met, it opened, the actual date that the cases were actually, began to be adjudicated was, I believe, January 5th. And so by February 12th of the April 1st start date timeframe, that cap was met. The first, that 33,000 was met pretty quickly. And in prior years, it was March, like a month later. And that chart at the bottom is just to provide some information about how much quicker it is moving. It's about a month faster for the April 1st start date. And then the October 1st start date back in 2017, it was, so that would technically be that October 1st, 2016 date. It was met in January of 2017. So the H-2B program, just as a high level, summary, it has become much more competitive and everything is moving a lot faster. And so there's the 33,000 positions available for the 2 parts of the year. October 1st is the first part, the beginning of the fiscal year for the federal government, and then April 1st is that window for the second part of the year, and that's that 33,000. There were more spots made available this year. So there was 22,000, but 16,000 were from essentially any country, and then 6,000 were from the Northern Triangle, Central American countries. The initial 16,000 was met within probably, I think, 3 to 4 days of that, the additional spots becoming open. So and I think I've touched on the other parts of the new group selection process, but if anyone has any additional questions about that, I would be happy to answer those questions. And again, having conservative timelines for all the entire process is very important. We want to make sure that prevailing wage requests are filed, if possible, at least 2 months before your 90-day window prior to your start date opens. And that's definitely a good strategy to be conservative. The other thing is that if it's a newer, if you haven't done H-2Bs in the past, it's best to have your statement of need and your documentation ready to respond to the government if there is a notice of deficiency or request for evidence from the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. But having that documentation, invoices, or like Carrie was mentioning, T times, just your business operation documentation, having that ready to provide to the government is important, because notice of deficiencies you have to respond to within 10 business days. So that time frame is pretty quick turnaround. And then the other thing is that for the April 1st time frame, that season, it's best to try to have that start date or very close to that start date, because most of the time that cap is going to be met. 33,000 is going very fast. And the only other thing for October 1st start dates, you would want to be pretty close to that as well, because it is a slower season, but we have been seeing it increase, the speeds increase when that cap is met as well. And the last thing would be, as a strategy, again, just trying to coordinate efforts with potentially another, there are databases out there where you can coordinate with another company and try to hire cap exempt workers, meaning someone who's already gone through the cap, and then you're trying to connect basically their season that they're currently on to your season. Trying to use those cap exempt workers, the H-2B workers, is always a good strategy as well. Like we mentioned at the beginning, variations with the date of need, more than 10 days is absolutely a red flag. And so it's important to try to keep those seasons the same.
Yeah, as Dave mentioned, the cap, the 33,000 cap is really a pain. And as Lisa mentioned at the top of the hour, there are lobbying efforts, and we do hope that additional numbers will be generated or some other type of relief, because obviously temporary labor is in very high demand, and employers will do almost anything to get temporary support. We've seen a huge uptick in domestic tourism, but companies and resorts are not able to provide the services that they normally would because they can't get H-2B workers or other temporary workers, even domestic, meaning U.S. workers. So, I mean, all of this, the point of all of this, this discussion today is really enforcement. H-2B is a compliance target, and it has been for years and years and years. And the primary enforcement mechanism that we're all well prepared to deal with and to respond to, but obviously don't want is the notice of deficiency. So after we file an ETA 9142B to the Department of Labor, an analyst will review that application and within seven days issue either a notice of acceptance saying, we agree with your statement of need and the data that you put in your application, and we'll continue to process it and you can do recruitment. Or they'll issue a notice of deficiency. And the notice of deficiency will flag issues. Almost in every notice of deficiency, it's a statement of temporary need. So they want employers to supply additional evidence to respond to that statement of temporary need, or to flesh out the statement. Sometimes the statement isn't detailed enough or doesn't really correspond to the day and the month requested. We have 10 business days to respond to those notices of deficiency. Obviously, we want to act as quickly as possible because a notice of deficiency can delay entire processes and can impact the tier selection of applications. So we really want to act quickly to respond to those. Again, we need evidence readily available. So sometimes it's payroll records, sometimes it's just supplemental publicly available information pertaining to tourist season, tea times, occupancy records, anything that would show an uptick in demand during that particular time. Another enforcement mechanism that we routinely see that's controlled by the Department of Labor would be an audit. And the funny thing about audits is that they're not done concurrently with the contract. They're typically done after the contract concludes. So with an audit, you're responding to an inquiry based on a prior year or prior season's needs, sometimes 2 years. I think one time I even saw 3 years prior. So you're it's very important to keep records, payroll records, business records about temporary need, and other documentation in connection with your H-2B program so that you can respond to those audits. If the government finds that the response to the audit was insufficient, it could leverage a couple of different additional enforcement mechanisms that we'll talk about in a second. Or it could deny the application. It could deny subsequent applications. And an audit with an insufficient response could result in a wage and hour investigation. And I've mentioned that a couple times during this presentation. It's really a forensic investigation of your H-2B program, substantial documentation. It's just basically a dump of HR documentation for all of your employees that were there during that temporary need, because again, they're going to look at corresponding employment, they're going to look at the hours worked, they're going to look at wage rates, they're going to look at overtime. They want to see everything in connection with your H-2B program. I did mention private lawsuits. There are H-2B support organization and advocacy organizations that will help H-2B workers sue their employers if they're not being treated fairly, or if there's discrimination, or if they're not getting the benefits that they were promised. And we see this in the context of sometimes of recruiting agencies and staffing agencies that employers use. But again, there's joint and several liability if you're co-employing. And so the ultimate end user of those workers is liable for any wrongdoing of the underlying staffing or recruitment or agent. So it's very important that if you are using an agent or recruiting or staffing agency, that they're fully transparent and supply you with copies of their H-2B application so that you know what you're getting into. Penalties for violation. What's the next one? If there's an audit and DOL doesn't think that the employer responded sufficiently, you could experience supervised recruitment. So basically, it's just the H-2B program on steroids from the Department of Labor. Much more oversight, much more scrutiny. They say where and when to recruit. You know, they say who and how the person, a U.S. worker is interviewed. Another penalty would be revocation of certification. So if you have a contract in place, it could be revoked. I see that we only have 2 minutes, so I'm going to go fast. I think here probably the most serious problem would be debarment. So you can't use H-2B anymore. And then there's criminal liability as well if there's a pattern in practice or if there's harboring of unauthorized workers. Some key takeaways, of course. You want to get proper support, right? So you want to have experienced H-2B filers, whether it be attorneys, and we would always recommend using attorneys rather than agents or staffing agencies because there are some reputational issues. They're not all bad, but again, full transparency and monitoring of who you're using. Know your risks, know your obligations. And if you're willing to carry risk, okay, but if there's an audit, you may get in trouble. And keep records. I think Dave and I have both said a number of times, you know, for golf courses, it'd be tee times, it would be, you know, occupancy reports, number of workers, historical payroll data, historical pay data, and then, excuse me. Because if you're ever audited, it's all going to be based on the document that you supply, and the better records you have, the more likely it is that you'll be successful in response to an investigation. So I think we're going to close there. Dave, did you have anything to add? We're just at time, actually.
Yeah, no, and like I've emphasized already, it's just it's become very competitive, as most of you probably know, and you know, just having everything prepared in advance with a conservative timeline, that's the main goal, just so you can, you know, maximize the odds of trying to get these H-2B workers. Hopefully, like Carrie mentioned, they, you know, lobbying efforts to increase these numbers, but it has been a pretty difficult run, it looks like. You know, the last administration and then this current administration, we'll see. That's it. But yeah. Thank you, everyone, for your time today.
Thank you for presenting. There is a question here that's been typed in, and if anybody else has questions, please type those in or raise your hand. We can unmute you. But this one is, if we get a tropical storm come through and we're not able to work for a day or 2 or 3, and the workers don't get the required 35 hours, are we in direct violation of the program?
Yeah, and this would be over a 12-week period, so you do have to basically average out the amount of work over the 12-week period. So the specifics would have to be looked at, obviously, but generally, if it's the 3/4 of a 12-week period they look at.
Okay, thank you. I understand Bob Helland from our team may want to speak. Go ahead, Bob. Hi.
Hi, Lisa. Hi, Dave. Thank you so much. And Carrie, thank you so much for your great presentation. I just want to point out and stress again that our advocacy efforts are ongoing on H-2B. Dave mentioned them. Dave mentioned, for example, the extra 22,000 visas that are in place this year, the 6,000 set aside for the Northern Triangle countries, excuse me, and the 16,000 remaining. That came because GCSAA is part of a broader effort to lobby for the H-2B program here in Washington, where I am. And we've made our efforts known to many of the decision makers in Congress, as well as on an individual level and through our grassroots ambassadors program that Michael Lee manages. So I think that the 22,000 is a step in the right direction. By no means is it the be all and end all to helping an absurdly low cap. But I want to stress to folks that for the past 6 years that I've been working for you directly and the 10 years prior to that, this has remained a priority. In addition, we do also have to report to folks that there is a standalone bill, the H-2B Returning Worker Exemption Act of 2021, HR 3897, that was introduced by Congressman Henry Cuellar of Texas. It's a bipartisan bill, and what it would do is permanently exempt from the cap any worker returning to the U.S. within the past 3 years. These are major steps forward. We're getting on the record with people here in Washington at a time that labor is in short, there's a high demand for labor across the country, especially within seasonal industries such as golf. So we're going to continue to fight this battle. I'm happy to report we've got some solid achievements to report, and we will continue to fight this battle as we go through the next Congress and into next year. Thank you, Lisa, and Dave. Thanks again for the great presentation on H-2B.
Thank you, Bob. Thanks for the information.
Yeah, we appreciate that. There's another question here, Dave. Would a private golf course on a private ranch qualify for H-2A visa?
Yeah, so generally I would say no, but to give you an example, what would have to be qualified? We would have to show that it's an agricultural, zoning. We would have to show that you're performing something with crops, and that's where I mean maybe part of your private ranch might have some farming activities, but if the workers aren't working on those agricultural activities, then that would be an issue. To give you an example, the closest I've gotten with trying to get from H-2Bs over to H-2As is we had a equine hospital, and they specifically work on horses, and so we were able to qualify horses under livestock, which falls under crops, and then show they were agriculturally zoned. But there's quite a few steps to get over there, and I think the Department of Labor would push back based on the types of activities the workers would be performing for the private golf course on the private ranch, but something that could be possibly looked into further.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. If you have other questions, now is the time. We have a number of other webinars that are upcoming, as you can see on the screen there. Hope you can join us for some of those. I will also mention Golf Championship registration is open. So if you're interested in that, we'd love to have you join us for that. Dave, any closing remarks here?
No, I think I've emphasized enough that it's just a race to the finish with these H-2Bs, especially in the April 1st start date season. It's become very, very competitive. So yeah, if you do have any questions or concerns, please feel free to reach out at david.wagner@ogletreedeacons.com. I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.